Hello there. Tonight, we'll spend a quiet evening with a small band of people at the mouth of a limestone cave, somewhere on the cold steppe, more than 20,000 years ago. The last great ice age is at its deepest, and these are our own ancestors, the ones who figured out how to live through it. We'll sit with them by a low fire while the snow drifts past, and look in on how they kept warm, kept fed, and kept each other through the long, long winter. Oh, and by the way, if you'd like an even better way to listen to our stories, you might want our app. It's called Tonight. You choose the voice that reads to you and what plays softly underneath. A little rain, a crackling fire, the ocean, on their own or all together. You can also set a timer, and your phone drifts off when you do. It's a free download. The link's just below this video. Take a moment now to settle. Close your eyes if you'd like to. Place a hand on your stomach if it feels good, and take a slow, deep breath all the way down. Feel the belly rise, and a long, slow breath out. The Ice Age was not one long night of cold. It was a very long, cold season in the life of the Earth, lasting in its most recent form for tens of thousands of years. The world we live in now, with its warm middle latitudes, its broad farmland, its quiet rivers, is the strange exception. For most of the time that anyone resembling us has been alive, the planet was colder than this, sometimes far colder. Geologists call the most recent cold age the Pleistocene. It stretched on, with long advances and slow retreats of the ice, for more than 2.5 million years. The deepest and coldest stretch of that age, the one we usually mean when we say the Ice Age, came near its end. It is called the last glacial maximum. At its coldest, about 20,000 years ago, great ice sheets covered most of northern Europe and almost all of Canada. The sea was much lower than it is today. Whole landscapes that are now underwater lay open to the wind. Through all of this, there were people, small bands of them, scattered thinly across the cold continents. They were not so different from us. Their hands were our hands, their minds our minds. They lived, on the whole, quietly and slowly. They kept their small fires burning, and they made it through. This is the story of how they did it. The world they lived in was unlike anything alive today. Across northern Europe, Central Asia, and what is now Siberia and Alaska, there stretched a vast, cold grassland that scientists call the mammoth steppe. It was the largest land biome of its time. It ran almost unbroken from the plains of France all the way to the Yukon. It was neither forest nor tundra of the modern kind. It was open, dry, windy grass, tough, short, full of nutrients, and on it grazed enormous herds of large animals. Mammoths walked there. So did woolly rhinos and bison and wild horses and reindeer in their thousands. Cave lions hunted in the snow. Cave bears slept the cold months away in deep limestone caves. Giant deer, with antlers wider than a man could stretch his arms, moved through the river valleys. To the north of the steppe lay the ice. The great northern ice sheet covered Scandinavia, Britain north of about where London now sits, and most of what is now Russia's far north. In North America, an enormous ice sheet covered nearly all of Canada and stretched down into what is now the northern United States. The ice was a kilometer thick in many places. In some places, it was more than 3 kilometers thick. The sea was lower because so much of the world's water was locked up in the ice. The English Channel was a wide, cold valley you could walk across. Britain was joined to Europe by dry land. Siberia was joined to Alaska by a wide, grassy plain we now call Beringia. People walked from one continent to another without ever knowing they had done it. This was the world the small bands moved through. Cold, windy, open, and full of game. The Ice Age was not new to humans. Long before our own kind reached its coldest plains, other people had lived through the long winter of the earth. Chief among them were the Neanderthals. They were a separate branch of the human family. They had broader shoulders than ours, stronger arms, a slightly shorter and stockier build. Their bones were heavier. Their faces were broader, with a low forehead and a thick brow. They had lived in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before our own ancestors arrived. They had survived several earlier glacial periods. They were, in their way, the first humans of the cold. They made fire. They wore clothing of some kind, though probably less tailored than what came later. They made stone tools of real skill, including spear points which they fixed to wooden shafts with pitch from birch bark. They hunted large animals at close range. They cared for their old and their injured. There are skeletons of Neanderthal men and women who lived for many years with serious wounds, which means someone else was bringing them food. They buried their dead. At the cave at Shanidar, in what is now northern Iraq, several Neanderthal burials have been found. One of them, an old man, had been laid carefully in the cave floor among traces of plant pollen, suggesting flowers had been placed with him, though scholars still debate the meaning. By about 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone. Our own kind, modern humans, had arrived in their lands. The two peoples met. They sometimes mingled. Even today, most people of European and Asian descent carry a small amount of Neanderthal ancestry in their DNA. Then, slowly, the older people faded away. Why is still not fully known. The cold may have grown sharper than even they could meet. The newcomers may have hunted the same animals more efficiently. They may have simply blended into a larger population. What is sure is that they had lived through the long cold for far longer than we have. They were the first to learn it. The first and most important technology of the cold was fire. Fire was not new in the Ice Age. People had been keeping fires for hundreds of thousands of years by then. But during the long cold, fire became the center of everything. The hearth was the home. Where the fire was, the band was. Where the fire was not, no one could stay long. In open country, where there were no trees, the fuel was often bone. Dry, oily mammoth bone burns slowly and gives off a steady heat. So do the bones of other large animals. Sites have been found across the steppe where the hearths held bones rather than wood, layered carefully, fed through the night. Where there were trees, there was wood. Pine, birch, willow, juniper. The branches were broken small and stacked, and the fire was kept low and steady. A bright, leaping fire wastes fuel. A low, hot fire lasts the night. The hearth was usually a shallow pit lined with stones. The stones held the heat after the fire had died down. A person could sit beside the warm stones for hours after the last flame had gone out. Around the hearth, the band did almost everything. They cooked their meat there. They scraped their hides there. They made their tools there. They told their stories there, in whatever language they spoke, which we will never hear. The fire kept the wolves away at night. It dried the wet boots and the wet clothes. It melted snow for drinking water. It gave the children somewhere warm to sit beside. A band that lost its fire was in real trouble. So they carried it. Embers in a horn, or in a hollow piece of bone, packed with dry moss or fungus, would smolder for hours if the air was right. A band on the move kept the old fire alive long enough to start the new one. The fire passed, in this way, from camp to camp, sometimes for years on end. The second great technology was the needle. It is easy to overlook. A small sliver of bone, smoothed and polished, with a tiny hole drilled at one end. But the eyed needle, which appeared in the archaeological record around 40,000 years ago, may have done more to keep humans alive in the cold than almost anything else. Before the needle, clothing was simple. A hide wrapped around the body, a skin tied at the shoulder. This is warm enough for mild cold. It is not warm enough for the steppe in winter. With a needle, you can sew. You can sew small pieces of hide into shapes that fit the body. Sleeves, hoods, leggings, mittens. You can join two layers so that they hold a still pocket of warm air between them. You can close the seams so that the wind does not get in. You can make boots that fit the foot. The needles found at Ice Age sites are tiny and very fine. Some of them are no thicker than a modern sewing needle. They were drilled by carefully rotating a small flint point against the bone until the hole came through. Each one represents hours of patient work. The thread was sinew, long, strong fibers taken from the legs and backs of animals. Sinew dries hard and holds a stitch well. The needle and the sinew together made tailored clothing possible. What did Ice Age clothing look like? More is known than there used to be. From burial sites, archaeologists have found beads sewn in long lines along where seams once were. They have found patterns suggesting parkas with hoods, long pants tucked into boots, mittens fastened to sleeves. The clothing was layered. The inner layer, often a soft animal skin worn fur in, held warm air close to the skin. The outer layer, fur out, shed the snow. In the very coldest places, people wore furs of Arctic fox, hare, and wolf. They lined their boots with grass for insulation, the way the people of the far north of Scandinavia still do. They sometimes sewed the clothing right onto the body for a season, and unpicked it again only when the warmer months came. Tailored clothing is what made the high latitudes livable. Without it, no human, however determined, can spend a winter on the open steppe. With it, the cold becomes ordinary. It becomes weather. Now to the shelter. This is where the patience and ingenuity of the Ice Age people show most clearly. So here, step by step, is how a winter house was built on the open steppe, in a place where no trees grew tall enough to be timber. First, the site had to be chosen. The band looked for a sheltered hollow, out of the worst of the prevailing wind, near a source of water, a stream, a riverbank, a lake margin. Often the site was used year after year. Some of the best-known mammoth bone houses, found in what is now Ukraine, sit at sites that were used over and over by different bands across many generations. Second, the floor was dug. A shallow, round pit, perhaps about 1.5 feet deep and 13 to 16 feet across, was scraped out of the ground. The cold earth below the surface holds a steadier temperature than the air. Sinking the floor a little keeps the wind from sweeping through and traps the warmth from the hearth. Third, the bones were laid. The frame of the house was built from the bones of mammoths. Skulls were set around the rim of the pit with their tusks curving up. Long bones, leg bones, ribs, jaw bones, were stacked and interlocked to form low walls. At the site we call Medji Reach, in what is now Ukraine, a single such house was found to contain the bones of nearly 150 mammoths, gathered over years. The bones were not freshly killed for the purpose. They were collected from old kills, from the steppe, from the river margins where animals had died and lain a long time. Fourth, the roof was raised. A frame of long bones, perhaps strengthened with whatever wood could be found. Driftwood from the river, branches dragged from a distant copse, arched up to form a low dome. The frame was lashed together with sinew and strips of hide. Fifth, the covering was put on. Animal hides, scraped and softened and sewn together, were stretched over the bone frame. They were pegged down at the edges with smaller bones or stones. The hides made the house wind-tight. Snow piled against the lower walls in winter and added another layer of insulation. Inside, it grew dim and warm. Sixth, the hearth was set. A shallow, stone-lined pit in the center or to one side. A vent in the roof above let the smoke out, slowly, while letting little wind in. The fire below the vent kept the inside warm and dry. Seventh, the inside was furnished. Sleeping platforms were made of more bones, raised a little off the ground, padded with hides and furs. Tools were kept in a corner. The hides hanging on the walls absorbed sound and held heat. A few small lamps, bowls of stone with a wick of moss floating in animal fat, gave a soft yellow light through the long winter evenings. A house like this could shelter perhaps 8 or 10 people. A small settlement of 3 or 4 such houses, set close together with a shared work area between them, made a winter village. The Mammoth Bone Village was the apartment block of the late Ice Age. Inside it was quiet, smoky, warm, full of the small business of long winters. Sewing, mending, napping, telling. Where caves were available, and across much of Europe they were, people used them instead. A cave with a good south-facing mouth and a flat, dry floor was a fine place to spend a winter. A windbreak of hides and bones at the entrance kept the cold out. A hearth near the front kept the family warm. The deeper rooms, in the dark, were used for other things, for storage, for shelter from the worst weather, sometimes for painting on the walls. Food on the open steppe was, above all, meat. The big herd animals, mammoth, bison, horse, reindeer, were the main source of calories through most of the year. A single mammoth could feed a small band for many weeks. The meat was eaten fresh when it could be, and dried or frozen for later. The fat was prized. In the cold, fat was almost more important than meat itself, because it gave the body the slow, steady warmth it needed to survive the winter. Hunting was not the dramatic affair it is sometimes imagined to be. It was careful, patient, and planned. The bands knew where the herds moved with the seasons. They knew which valleys held animals in spring, which marshes held them in fall. They used the land. A herd guided into a narrow ravine or onto a frozen river where the footing was poor, or up against a cliff, could be taken with less risk to the hunters. The spear, and later the spear thrower, did the rest. A second source of food, less famous but very important, was fishing. Where there were rivers, there were salmon and trout and pike. Where there were lakes, there were perch. Ice Age people made nets of plant fiber and small bone fish hooks and barbed harpoons of antler. In some seasons, fish made up a large part of the diet. A third source was gathering. Even on the steppe, even in the winter, there were things to gather. Roots dug from the frozen ground with bone picks. Berries dried at the end of summer and stored in skin bags. Mushrooms. Nuts where there were trees. Bird eggs in spring. Honey when a hive could be found. Careful analysis of plant remains at Ice Age sites tells us that people ate plants more than was once thought. And there was storage. A people who could not store food could not survive a long winter on the steppe. The Ice Age bands stored meat in pits dug into the frozen ground, where it kept like a natural cold cellar for months. They smoked and dried meat over slow fires. They rendered fat into hard cakes that could be carried and would not go bad. A well-stocked winter camp held enough food, in pits and on racks and in skin bags, to carry the band from the first snow through to the early light of spring. The thinness of the spring months, before the herds returned, was the hardest stretch of the year. Then the band lived on the last of the stores, on whatever they could trap, on patience. The tools of the Ice Age are what archaeologists find most of, because stone keeps. Walk the floor of an Ice Age cave that has been excavated, and you can see thousands of small flakes and blades of flint, scrapers and points and burins, laid out by the people who made them and never picked back up. The basic technique was knapping. A core of good stone, flint, chert, obsidian where it could be found, was struck with a hammer of antler or bone, and long, thin blades came away from the core. The blades were the raw material. From them, a knapper could make almost anything. A long, sharp blade was a knife. A blade trimmed at one end was a scraper for working hides. A blade pointed at one end and notched at the base was a spear tip. A blade with a fine, beaked point was a burin for carving bone and antler. A small, very sharp microblade set in a row into a slot in a piece of bone made a long composite edge, what you might call an early sickle or an early saw. Stone was only the beginning. Bone and antler were just as important. Antler is springy and strong. Bone is harder and holds an edge. From these, Ice Age people made needles, harpoons, fish hooks, awls, spear throwers, the handles for stone blades. They made buttons and beads and small ornaments. They made flutes, carved from the wing bones of vultures and the leg bones of bears. The spear thrower deserves a moment of its own. It is a simple thing, a short stick of antler or wood with a hook or socket at one end. The butt of a spear sits in the socket. The thrower acts as an extension of the arm. With it, a hunter could send a spear faster and further and harder than by hand alone. It made hunting the big game safer. It is one of the great unsung inventions of the human past. The tools were carried, mended, resharpened, and carried again. A good blade was used until it could be used no more, and then ground down and made into something smaller. Nothing was wasted. The whole household of a small band could be carried, in a pinch, on the backs of its members. The Ice Age bands moved. They were not nomads in the modern sense. They did not wander aimlessly. They moved in a pattern, year after year, between known places. A winter camp in a sheltered valley. A spring camp along a river where the salmon ran. On the high steppe in summer near the great herds. At the foot of the hills in fall, where the reindeer came through on their annual migration. The places were old. They had been used by their parents and their parents' parents and on back. A band was usually small, 20 or 30 people perhaps. Several families together, often closely related. The size was set by the food the land could support, and by what a group could move and feed at once. A band much larger than that began to strain its winter stores. A band much smaller had too few hands for the work. Bands met other bands. They had to. Marriages between bands were necessary, for the simple reason that the children of a single band would soon be too closely related to each other. Trade also passed from band to band. A piece of fine flint from a quarry in one valley might travel hundreds of miles in the hands of friends and in-laws. Shells from the distant sea have been found at sites deep inland. Amber from the northern coast has been found in caves far to the south. How did news travel? On feet, slowly. A man or a woman might walk for weeks to visit another band, carrying news, gifts, marriage offers, songs. The summer gatherings, when several bands came together for a season at a known site, were a chance to do all of this at once. To meet old kin, to trade, to find a partner. to sing the long songs together, to bury the dead. The pace of life was slow by our reckoning. There were no calendars. There were the seasons and the herds and the rivers and the moon and the stars. There was the great cold winter and the green return. The Ice Age people made art. Of all the things they have left us, this is the one that catches the heart most easily, because it shows us that they were, plainly, ourselves. The cave paintings of Europe are the most famous. The painted cave at Lascaux in southwestern France was made around 17,000 years ago. Its walls and ceilings are covered in great running horses, bulls, deer, and bison, painted in red ochre, yellow ochre, and black charcoal. The cave at Altamira in northern Spain has a low ceiling covered in bison, curled and resting, painted with such care that the painter used the natural curves of the rock to give the bodies their shape. The cave at Chauvet, also in France, holds paintings more than 30,000 years old. Lions, rhinos, horses, mammoths, drawn with a sureness of line that any artist today would recognize. The painters worked deep inside the caves, far from daylight, by the light of small stone lamps. They climbed and crawled to places that took real effort to reach. They left handprints on the walls, pressed in red or blown in outline with pigment from the mouth. The handprints are sometimes smaller than a child's, sometimes a grown adult's. Some are missing fingers, which has set off centuries of quiet speculation among scholars. There were also small carved objects made to be carried. The figurines we call Venus figures, small carvings of women, often plump, often without clear faces, sometimes only a few centimeters tall, have been found from France to Siberia. They were carved in mammoth ivory, in limestone, in bone, in baked clay. The oldest of them, from a German cave, is around 40,000 years old. There were flutes, too. Some of the oldest known musical instruments in the world are Ice Age flutes, made from the wing bones of birds and from the ivory of mammoths. They still play. Their notes are clear and sweet. And there were burials. The Ice Age dead were laid in the ground with care. With them were placed the things they had used in life, beads and ornaments sewn into the clothing they were buried in, tools they had made, sometimes ochre, sprinkled red over the body. At the site of Sungir, in what is now Russia, 2 children were buried about 34,000 years ago, with thousands of ivory beads sewn into their clothes, and with long, straightened lengths of mammoth tusk laid beside them. The work that went into those burials would have taken months. What the paintings meant, what the figures meant, what the burials meant, we cannot say. The bands left us their pictures, but not their words. We can only stand in front of the painted horses, in the soft yellow light of a cave that has not changed in 15,000 years, and feel quietly that they were, after all, our own kind. The Ice Age did not end suddenly. It ended slowly and with hesitation. Beginning around 15,000 years ago, the world warmed. The great ice sheets began to retreat. Forests crept north into ground that had been steppe. Rivers swelled with meltwater. Coastlines drowned slowly as the sea rose. Britain was cut off from the European mainland. The wide grass bridge between Asia and America sank under the rising water. The warming did not move in a straight line. About 12,800 years ago, the climate tipped back into cold again for more than 1,000 years. This stretch is called the Younger Dryas. The ice advanced a little. The bands adjusted as they always had. They moved south, or they hunkered down through another long cold. And then, around 11,700 years ago, the cold lifted for good. The Holocene began, the warm period we still live in. The world the bands had known did not survive the warming. The mammoth steppe broke up. Forests took over. The great herds of the open grassland thinned and, in many places, disappeared. The mammoths themselves grew rare, and then rarer, and then were gone. The last of them living on small Arctic islands as recently as 4,000 years ago. The cave lions and woolly rhinos vanished. The giant deer went too. The people remained. They adapted. In the forests, they hunted smaller game: red deer, wild boar, beaver. They fished more. They gathered more. They built different kinds of houses. In some places, they began to plant the seeds of the wild grasses they had been gathering, and to keep the animals they had been hunting. And from this, slowly, came farming. The villages grew larger. The world changed again. But for tens of thousands of years before all that, on the cold open plains and in the deep painted caves, small bands had lived through the long winter of the earth. They had built their bone houses. They had sewn their warm clothes. They had fed their slow fires and raised their children. They had painted their walls and buried their dead. They had kept the fire going. Above the empty steppe, the stars come out, bright and cold. Inside a low bone house, the fire has burned down to embers. The band is asleep beneath the furs. The hides on the walls hold the warmth in. Outside, the snow drifts on, slow and quiet. Somewhere beyond the camp, the herds are moving. The fire glows, low and steady and warm.